Chapter 8 3 Centuries of Romanovs, 1913. Growing up. One day in early 1913, Dr. Botkin arrived at the Alexander Palace to check on Alexei, who was still recovering from his illness in Spawa. As the doctor headed along the second-floor corridor, he heard a thumping sound coming from one of the rooms. Curious, the doctor peeked in. There was Anastasia, red-faced and sweating, and hopping on one leg. Struggling to keep a straight face, Dr. Botkin asked what she was doing. Without missing a hop, Anastasia breathlessly replied, "An officer told me that to jump around on one leg helps one grow." And she desperately wanted to grow, or something, she admitted. At 18, her oldest sister Olga had a round face and high cheekbones. 16-year-old Tatiana was willowy and tiny-waisted. 14-year-old Marie had a peaches and cream complexion. And Anastasia? At 12, she was short and chubby. True, people often commented on her good, strong Russian features, but they were lost in a face that one courtier called lumpy and lacking elegance. And in the past few months she had gotten so round, her family had given her a nickname, Kubishka. It meant dumpling. But it wasn't the girl's appearance that worried some members of the court. It was their emotional immaturity. They blamed this on Alexandra's obsessive desire to protect her daughters from the outside world. Even when grown, the empress continued to regard them as little children, recalled Anna Vyrubova. Isolated from society with no company but one another, the girls existed in a kind of time warp, one in which they never really grew up, recalled one courtier. When the two eldest had grown into real young women, one would hear them talking like little girls of 10 and 12. They would giggle, poke each other, and run into corners. The teenaged girls thought it especially fun when Olga led them all in a mock battle involving using toy guns and racing their bicycles through the palace rooms, and they still erupted into embarrassed giggles whenever the palace censor, whose job it was to clip out any unsuitable scenes from the films the family watched in the semicircular hall every Saturday night, missed an on-scene kiss or hug. Isolated, immature, naive. These were the Grand Duchesses on the eve of the biggest celebration Russia had ever seen. 300th anniversary. Feeling betrayed by their subjects, Nicholas and Alexandra had rarely appeared in public since the events of 1905, 8 long years ago. Once, when the English ambassador urged them to break down the barrier that exists between you and your people and regain their confidence, the Tsar had drawn himself up and replied haughtily, "Do you mean that I am to regain the confidence of my people, or that they are to regain my confidence?" The rift between ruler and subjects had continued to widen. But now a momentous event was approaching, the 300th anniversary of Romanov rule over Russia. Nicholas and his advisors saw it as the perfect opportunity to re-establish the Tsar's relationship with his subjects. They planned an extravagant week-long jubilee in St. Petersburg, complete with balls, operas, parades, firework displays, fairs, and concerts in the park. Pictures of every Romanov Tsar would be hung on the fronts of stores, and thousands of colored lights would be strung. Each night, the words "God gave the Tsar," as well as a double-headed Romanov eagle, would be illuminated. The Winter Palace would blaze with a huge portrait of Nicholas. In the workers' district, factories would be closed for the first day of the celebrations, and free meals served to the poor. Additionally, Nicholas would show his benevolence by granting amnesty to 2,000 political prisoners, all from the lower classes. Thousands of invisible threads center in the Tsar's heart, and these threads stretch to both the huts of the poor and the palaces of the rich, read one piece of Jubilee propaganda. Nicholas and Alexandra felt sure this display of power and opulence would inspire loyalty from their subjects. "No hope seems too confident or too bright," reported one British journalist. March 6, 1913, the first day of the long-planned celebrations, dawned with heavy clouds, a cold mist, and the occasional roll of thunder. As the imperial family's carriages traveled from the Winter Palace, where they had moved weeks earlier in preparation for the anniversary festivities, to a special Thanksgiving service at the Cathedral of Our Lady of Kazan, nothing seemed especially celebratory. The imperial banners of white, blue, and red that decorated the family's route hung dripping and dispirited, and the crowds, far smaller than anyone had expected, were subdued when the Tsar passed. Where was the cheering, the shouting, the singing? Instead, there was little real enthusiasms, little real loyalty, recalled one spectator. "I saw a cloud over the whole celebration." The triple row of guards and policemen standing between the Tsar's procession and the people added to the gloomy mood. Fears over bombs and assassination attempts had turned the capital into an armed camp. Meanwhile, inside the cathedral, 5,000 invited guests, nobles, diplomats, visiting dignitaries, generals, admirals, and government officials, as well as hundreds of policemen waited. Everywhere in the flickering light of the candles, gold glinted from the altar and icons to the priests' vestments and the great dome overhead. Candlelight reflected off the women's jewels, too, in a fantastic shower of diamonds, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, a blaze of fire and flame, recalled French Ambassador Maurice Paléolot. But just minutes before the imperial family arrived, a scuffle took place at the front of the cathedral. All eyes turned to see Duma President Michael Rodzianko glowering at Rasputin. The Staryets had taken a seat in a block of prominently placed chairs reserved for Duma members. Rodzianko could not believe the man's audacity. By doing so, Rasputin was publicly proclaiming his close ties to the throne. Infuriated, the Duma president, who believed all the rumors about the Staryets, shouted, "Clear out at once, you vile heretic!" Rasputin waved his invitation. "I was invited here by persons more highly placed than you," he replied. "Clear out," repeated Rodzianko, "or I'll order the sergeant-at-arms to carry you out." Refusing to budge, Rasputin looked at him coolly. Then his gaze grew intense. He looked deep into Rodzianko's eyes. Rodzianko felt a tremendous force surge through his body. Believing the Staryets was using hypnosis, I suddenly became possessed of an almost animal fury, he later recalled. "You are a notorious swindler," the Duma president shouted. At that, Rasputin dropped to his knees and began praying. Unable to control his rage, Rodzianko began kicking the Staryets in the ribs. But Rasputin remained on his knees. Finally, Rodzianko grabbed him by the scruff of the neck and heaved him into the aisle. Rasputin recognized defeat. Pulling himself up off the marble floor, he cried dramatically, "O Lord, forgive him such sin." Then, as all eyes watched, he strode from the cathedral and into his waiting automobile, yet another gift from the empress. Shocked whispers rippled through the congregation. The empress's expression as she entered the cathedral minutes later only added to the gossip. Her face was cold and expressionless, almost austere, said Muriel Buchanan, the British ambassador's daughter. The sight of 8-year-old Alexei didn't help either. Still unable to walk, he was carried to his seat by a cassock guard. Behind him, people put their hands together and whispered yet again, what was wrong with the future Tsar? At last, the 4 Grand Duchesses entered, in their white silk gowns with trains of red velvet. They looked like fairy princesses. All eyes watched as they took their places behind their parents and brother. "Is that Olga Nikolaevna?" some people might have whispered. "Who is the little one?" Hardly anyone could tell the Grand Duchesses apart. Almost always photographed in matching white dresses, they tended to be considered as a whole rather than as individuals. The Grand Duchesses obviously accepted this. Recently, they'd begun signing the letters and gifts they gave jointly as OTMA, a combination of the first letter of each of their names. As the music began, the congregation turned back toward the altar and the imperial couple. Alexandra stood stone-faced and straight as a stick, the diamonds covering her gown's bodice trembling with each nervous breath she took. Nicholas, too, appeared uneasy. Despite the tight security in and around the cathedral, he kept anxiously and furtively scanning the faces of the assembly as if afraid of meeting some secret danger, recalled one observer. It was obvious the Tsar no longer felt safe, even among his most loyal subjects. That's when some people noticed the imperial couple looking up into the shadowy heights of the cathedral dome. 2 doves circled over their heads. Believing in religious omens as they did, they took this as a good sign. A symbol, Nicholas later said, that the blessings of God, after 3 centuries, continue to rest on the Romanovs. 2 months later, as part of the anniversary celebration, the family took a week-long trip to Moscow. Along the route, people flocked to see them. In Kostroma, on the Volga River, people ventured waist-deep into the water for a closer look at the family, and in villages, old peasant men and women fell to their knees as the royals' cars whizzed past. From their open-topped Renaults, the family hardly noticed the little tables that stood before many of the huts. On them, peasants had laid flowers, salt, and bread, the traditional Russian offering to guests. But while the people acted curious or reverent, on only one occasion was the family greeted with spontaneous good feelings. It happened during a visit to an ancient monastery. An old peasant woman stepped from the gathered crowd and approached Alexandra. Falling on her knees, she begged the empress for a blessing. Alexandra made the sign of the cross above the woman's bent head. Then impulsively she unwound the silk shawl she was wearing and gave it to the peasant. The crowd burst into cheers. "God save the Tsar!" they cried. "Let your sovereign family live forever!" This single experience convinced both Nicholas and Alexandra that the Jubilee's mission had succeeded. Said the empress to a friend shortly after the celebrations, "You can see it for yourself. We need merely to show ourselves, and at once their hearts are ours." Added Nicholas, "My people love me." Nobody could have imagined that in less than 4 years Nicky's very name would be splattered with mud and hatred, his sister Olga later said. Teaching Alexei. Not long after the tercentenary celebrations, Pierre Gilliard, who had discovered the truth about Alexei's illness at Spawa, and Sidney Gibbs, who still knew nothing about it, began tutoring the Tsarevich. It was long past time for the almost 9-year-old to enter the classroom, but his frequent illnesses had delayed his education. Now, with the boy on the mend, the teachers began their lessons. Sadly, recalled Gilliard, Alexei had not been taught the habits of discipline. The boy hated to be corrected, and tended to be lazy. He also blamed his teachers for his being in the classroom. "I had a definite impression of his mute hostility," Gilliard wrote, "and at times it reached a stage of open defiance." What sort of defiance? The always reserved Gilliard did not elaborate. But Sidney Gibbs did. One day he taught Alexei to make a telephone by holding one end of a wire to his ear and the other between his teeth. But the project quickly turned into a scuffle, Gibbs fending off his student as Alexei struggled with all his might to wrap the wire around the teacher's teeth. Another time, the two skirmished over scissors. "I had rather a bad time," Gibbs wrote in dismay. "Alexei wanted to cut my hair, and then his own, and when I tried to prevent him, he went behind the curtain and held it round him. When I opened it, he had actually cut some hair off, and he was rather disconcerted when I told him he had a bald place. He would insist on cutting or pretending to cut everything. The more I tried to prevent him, the more he shrieked with delight." Concluded Gibbs, lessons with the Tsarevich were more exciting than pleasant. Still, Alexei was sensitive to the suffering in others because he suffered so much himself, claimed Gilliard. He also could be introspective. One bright summer day in 1913, 6 months after Alexei's ordeal at Spawa, Olga found Alexei lying on his back in the grass, gazing wistfully up into the sky. "What was he doing?" she asked. "I like to think and wonder," he replied. "About what?" "Oh, so many things," he said. "I enjoy the sun and the beauty of summer as long as I can. Who knows if one of these days I shall be prevented from doing it." Beyond the palace gates, a different kind of education for a different kind of boy. Around 1913, poverty forced the peasant father of 8-year-old Nicholas Gryaznov into an apprenticeship agreement with St. Petersburg shop owner A. Kasatkin. The father agreed that little Nicholas would work in the shop for 4 years, receiving a mere 3 rubles a month, not even enough to buy a cup of milk, plus room and board for his labor. In return, the shop owner promised to teach Nicholas a useful trade. But like most shop owners, Kasatkin looked upon his apprentices as nothing more than cheap labor. Expected to rise earlier than everyone else, around 4:30, the boy was on the go all day, delivering purchases, unpacking merchandise, or standing on the sidewalk in every kind of weather, coaxing customers into the store. Not until midnight did he finally drop onto his straw mattress in the kitchen. More than 5 other child apprentices were also squeezed into this space. All were poorly fed, badly clothed, and regularly beaten. Desperate to call attention to his son's plight, Nicholas's father sent a letter to the newspaper New Russia. Because censorship allowed for public discussion of social problems as long as they weren't blamed on the Tsar or his government, the newspaper ran the letter. It read, "I tried to take my son away and put him in another shop, but his boss wouldn't let him go. He said there was some kind of law which let him keep my son until the apprenticeship was over, that is, for 3.5 more years, and until then he wouldn't give him up. Kazatkin told me, the law gives me the right to teach the boy to be a human being and to hit him and even beat him with a rod if he is disrespectful to my family. If you want your son back, then you will have to pay me 300 rubles for my expense in training the boy. Then I'll give him to you."